Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am going to stand back here because I am used to having a clicker, and so I designed my slides with multiple clicking points, and otherwise if I was standing up there, whoever sat here would have to click the thing about 20 times to get through everything. So I'm just going to stand here. If I need to get a microphone, I can. Otherwise, I'll just let me know. I can holler a little bit louder. So this is part 3 of the Lenten series on the Confession of Belhar. I'll go over a little bit in a second the other parts that have occurred and will continue to occur. For anybody that, I was just giving Doug a little bit of a background on it, for anybody that didn't attend part 1 or part 2, the Confession of Belhar was written in 1986. Andrea, was Bellhar a place? Was that a name of a community or something? You know where that term comes from?
I don't know where Bellhar comes from.
Okay.
I'll Google it.
There you go. Max is going to Google it. Doug asked that question, and I said, I'm not quite sure where that term came from. But it was written in 1986 in apartheid South Africa and was really in response to apartheid and really speaking out against that system. The confession is really broken down into 5 pieces. There's the call to confess, there's a call to unity, a call to reconciliation, a call to justice, and a call to action. The meat of it is really points 2, 3, and 4. The call to confession at the beginning and the call to action at the end are really kind of smaller components of it. And so our series has included a topic on, or one session on the overall Confession of Belhar, a session on the call to unity. Today is about a call to reconciliation, and then the 4th session, which will be next week, will be a call to justice, and Ellen Murdoch will be giving that.
It's a suburb of City of Cape Town, South Africa.
Okay, Bellhar, Bellhar is a suburb of City of Cape Town, South Africa. So I'm guessing that the church or churches that initiated writing the confession were probably located there. So just to break down, some people have copies of the confession language. I'll admit at first I thought I kind of drew the short end of the stick when I got the session on reconciliation, because as we were meeting talking about this, we were trying to figure out exactly what does reconciliation mean in this context. I think unity is a fairly easy concept to grasp, and justice is as well, but how does reconciliation really play in to this overall confession? And so what I've tried to do here is sort of distill down the parts of the confession that talk about reconciliation. And like with the other sections of the confession overall, there are several bullet points on what we believe, and then there's a bullet point on sort of the therefore, here's how we will act, or here's how we respond. On the we believe side, there's kind of 4 major topics. The first is that God entrusts and really obligates the church universal to work toward reconciliation on earth. The second point is essentially that God has conquered irreconciliation and empowers us to reconcile. And so we're called to do this thing, and we have the ability and the power to do it because God has granted that ability and power to us. The third point is that the message, and I really added this in because I think what it gets at is really about Christianity itself as a belief system is really weakened when we allow things to occur that are at odds with our belief. If we allow and sit silently while things that are diametrically opposed to the tenets of Scripture to go on in the world. And then finally that any sort of politic or philosophy or teaching that supports and allows the separation is false doctrine and ideology. And so the section then gets into the therefore how we act, and it's really about rejecting a doctrine. And this, for the section on reconciliation, it's fairly short. And it just says, therefore we reject any doctrine that forces separation based on race and color. And again, getting into the context of this was written in apartheid South Africa. Apartheid was very much a physical separation of people based on their race, based on the color of their skin, different than the pre-Reconstruction, pre-Civil War America, and even different than the Jim Crow era of America. It was very much more physical separation. As Angie talked about a little bit in our first session 2 weeks ago, PCUSA, in finally getting around to considering and adopting this confession just a couple of years ago, did so because of the increased divisiveness and racism and injustice that is going on in our society right now. And so my read of the Confession of Belhar and how it's relevant to us, at least as far as PCUSA has couched the issue, is that separation is in many ways sort of synonymous with the divisiveness and racism and injustice that we see in our society today. So, just going back for a second and looking at these parts of separation, if we're allowing separation or any teaching that allows separation being false doctrine, that's kind of goes back, and anything that is encouraging or allowing us to continue to be divided, to allow injustice to occur, in PCUSA's interpretation, is sort of synonymous with separation in the confession. So I'll back up. Does anybody have a really good definition of reconciliation and how it applies? Feel free to jump out. So that I kind of had the same thought as I was looking at preparing for this. And I think there's a lot of different meanings to reconciliation, a lot of different ways that we can define it. One is restoring peace or unity. If you're reconciling your differences, you're coming back, you're ending an argument, you're coming back into a point of peaceful relationship. We can take that a little bit farther and talk about the relationship between God and us, reconciling with God if we have gone off the path, but also reconciliation between different groups, whether that's two different churches, different ethnic groups, different political groups, what have you. We can take it a little bit further and say that reconciliation is about changing the course of action, changing what you're doing, the way you're being, and really changing yourself. It's great to restore peace, but if you keep doing the same things you've been doing, it's not really truly reconciliation, so that takes it a little bit deeper. So as I looked through the confession as a whole, and specifically this reconciliation part, started to see there really being a twofold definition of reconciliation, or a twofold meaning as it applies in the confession. And the first is making one consistent with another. And if you think about reconciling your checkbook, reconciling your taxes, you're trying to line things up. And I think that in the confession, it's really, part of it is getting at making sure that what we believe and what we say and what we preach really reflects how we live and reflects the systems that we allow to happen, or that we support, or that we speak out against. And the second is really about healing. And I love the way that this was put forward in some of the materials that were provided by PCUSA about reconciliation, saying that we're really faced with a choice, and interesting that it kind of says reconciliation is a choice to make, but that we can live in hate and separation, or we can bind our wounds and love our brothers and sisters for the common good. So that kind of twofold aspect of addressing the way that we operate, but also looking at those things that how can we heal the wounds that are in place. And so the way that I am looking at this as related to the overall Confession of Belhar, which, as I mentioned earlier, really revolves around these three concepts of unity, reconciliation, and justice, is that you can kind of see the parallels there, but it's that together we look and see where our actions and beliefs misalign. I think the confession is really not, I think we should all do this on an individual basis, but it's really calling us to look at this corporately as a church, as Christ Presbyterian, but also as a larger church overall. But that together we see where those actions and beliefs misalign, that together we look to bind up the wounds and to provide healing. And that then we can work together to right the wrongs. And what really started to stand out to me about this is that, I talked earlier, that second point in the text in the confession is that God really gives us this gift of reconciliation, empowers us. And that is what is giving us the power to change, the power to heal, but that's what actually gives us the power to work toward justice. That justice is not something that we can work toward until the reconciliation has begun to occur, which I found to be a really interesting concept overall. Andrea gave a presentation on the Desmond Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness, recently, and there was a book discussion that happened as well. And one of the quotes that she had up was this, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. And when you were giving that presentation and you had that quote up there, it reminded me of a quote, and it took me a little bit to find it again because it had been a while since I'd seen it. I don't know if anybody's ever heard this, but this was back in the 1970s and 80s. There were some Aboriginal activists in Australia, and this quote is often credited to this woman, Lilla Watson, but she tends to prefer to attribute it to everybody in the movement because it was something kind of that they're working toward together. It says, but if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think if you look at the quotes and the thoughts and the philosophies of Martin Luther King Jr. and of James Baldwin, you'll see some other things like this where it talks about our liberation, our humanity being really tied up in each other's state of being. And I think this kind of brings it back again to, if we try to work for justice for people that don't have the same privileges that we have, but we do it in sort of a paternalistic way of being, we're going to help you out, then it's not nearly as meaningful if we realize that we have this relationship and that none of us can be free if we're not all free. So that's kind of my overall take of where reconciliation falls within the confession overall and what it means. And I thought what would be really a good way, what I really wanted to do is I wanted you to find somebody you had problems with and work for reconciliation, but I thought that may not be the most comfortable thing to do. And so what I'd like to do, we got started really late, so we only have maybe about 5 or 10 minutes. But what I would like to do, if you could just kind of grab a few people, groups 3, 4, or 5 maybe, and take a look at a few of these questions, and maybe let's simplify it a little bit and just say, where are the separations that exist locally and across the country, and what can we do to work to heal those separations and bind the wounds? And one thing that I think is also an interesting question to think about is that third one of how do we reconcile in a place where there's no relationship that's existed before. If those of us generationally have come into places where the divide and the separation has occurred for such a long point that we were born into a place where there is no reconciliation. And I think especially, that in apartheid South Africa with the younger people, that was a relevant question as well, and I think can be a question for us today. So, grab a few people and let's talk about a couple of these questions real quick, and then if we have any time before we have to go, we can maybe have a few points come out. And I'd say if you don't want to try to hit on all 4, you can just pick your favorite question and talk about it.
Person we need to reconcile.
We are where we are as far as service, I think would be something that some people might get a little concerned about. Their sexual preference, that's just not state, city. This does not look like some of the churches. We've got violence, and it's not violence because socially, economically, racially. I think two educational levels, there's a separation. In a lot of it.
Yeah, Max, I think 2 weeks ago, made the comment that he was quoting, paraphrasing, quoting something else, that 10 to 11 million on some things is almost segregated.
Yeah, mine too.
And I think, to me, part of it is the separations, and where are the separations that function and imaging versus those that are maybe more preference. Because I think that very much our two services based on preference for style of worship as opposed to, I don't want to be around those people because they believe something different than I do.
That's true.
That's me personally. Students struggle with this. But yet, we also not have specific chapters where black students can teach other black students.
I'm trying to learn to read.
So that was always a big debate. Contextualize ministries for certain groups, or should, and it's that what you say about preference. So I guess the key is there's some irreconciliation there. So if those groups can then come together, first and second service come together and worship together, then I don't see that as irreconciliation. It's where you can come together because you're critical of that.
And we're coming together, I think, is really important. So, I think it's really important for us to go ahead and go into the places and reach and we should really have that.
That's kind of the number 3. Reconcile relationship is be proactive in the relationship.
I used to go to this for how this is unfolding. And when I was in Chicago, he was just playing about this size, that was fat, shoulder to shoulder. I was the only white person there. That was intense. Because you really definitely feel too many people come and feel a lot of times it really brought some understanding to someone down there.
I mean, it would be nice if I could just understand what crisis
Black people politically active a little bit for 30 years. Do I address it? I do have some relationship with a black community. It just may be, subtly, I keep it at arm's length. So, I've got identify that relationship and reaching out.
getting some information.
I think we talked about that. We're kind of being a husband. We did different for both sides of whatever discussion is. And we're always arguing about these things. We didn't start talking about it. And I was like, I don't agree that we disagree. No. So, okay, I don't pass that anything to do with agreeing or not. But yeah. And there's lots of stuff that I can talk about. And so on this questionnaire that I was asking people, what color?
And then I got to know.
And he was like, I'm sorry, and I would just, I'm sorry, I think this questionnaire is kind of, this is what the question is. Yes, and it was very interesting because I allowed them to tell me what color. Some of them said black, some of them said brown, some of them said tan. It was that whole spectrum, and I thought, oh, interesting, and then I remembered in the book, it said that what was so bad about Conte is that people were putting groups by their color, not by the fact that they were black. Like black people here, black people here, if you're really black people here. So we do. So I wonder how much of that is part of what we do.
Well, I think of course, I think we definitely subconsciously do that. If you don't like black people, have different experiences in terms of people are subject to I don't think we ever had that as officially,
They have 12 disciples, 2 swords. And that is the same narrative
You were black, you were.
in Matthew.
If you had any.
The Peter sells off the year, go to but it's so easy to
I'm also challenged.
I think it's
you have to
Every time I hear
what
you
are
yeah, and of course that's, I'm NT and live in my head, it's so easy. I'm kind of an introvert, and get into it, and you keep pushing, but it's really tough to let go of
The thing that gets me about tried to force
in these things, everyone wants the other one to make the first.
I wish I had not done it.
because community is different. I can be nice to you, but friendly. I kind of like you, but that doesn't mean we're hang out with you. But that's what they were pushing for. Because really pushed community. And it's, I feel like it's overstepping.
Those
are our actions.
Yeah.
I agree. There's another way.
If you try to win every battle, you lose.
Things that we should all, even if we don't hang out together, things that we sort of all share responsibility. And I think it's sort of like that. You live in the same city, you're paying taxes because you have a shared responsibility for these things. And I kind of feel like some of this is so it's not that we're necessarily going to expect everyone to taste music and enjoy the same foods, but that there's places where we have to share.
But I think those are things we do, most of us, I would say, teach our children. Be respectful. Don't bully. There's different kinds of backgrounds. My kids were little, but those are just things we teach. Most of us would teach our small children. And somehow that's changed in our society. I'm probably going on.
You can't force community, but you can call people to the reality. I mean, because the reality is we are medicine. Together we are responsible. what happens in medicine. You can, no, I don't want to be. Well, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it's also to not say that somebody else's problem,
Yeah.
but to recognize that, yes, to very we all have some degree of responsibility. So we've got just a couple of minutes until. Wait, do we have who's second service? A couple of us? Okay. Okay. Well, because I was looking around and thinking, well, we got a lot of first service people in here. Yeah. So I'm curious to know just before people have to take off. And I'm going to turn on the microphone since some people are still talking. Any thoughts that came out? Any key points or highlights that your group discussed? Yell into the microphone.
Yeah, one of the things Doug brought up was praying for people that you have separation with, which seems really obvious, but it's not something I do. It's hard to see people physically when you get so angry. And it's hard to be angry with people that you're praying for.
Other thoughts? Any standout points of discussion? Scott, you had one about how we reconcile when no relationship existed. You want me to paraphrase?
I think I wanted to argue with you just a little tiny bit.
That's great.
I suspect you
do it.
disagree. There aren't people we don't have any relationship with. There are people we have invisible relationships with, but the coffee I have in my hand puts me in a relationship with people in Africa and Latin America who I don't know in an economic kind of way. And I can go on forever with that in terms of those kinds of relationships. So figuring out how I recognize that relationship and begin to take my responsibilities in that relationship more seriously is I think the point. And maybe you want to paraphrase it better.
Yeah. No, I think that was great. That's what I was hoping to.
So I'm just going to just briefly say that in our group we really focused on our closest relationships and families, where reconciliation really needs to take place, and particularly in the political climate. So that's why we're over here a little teary.
What was the discussion over here?
We have two groups.
Yeah.
We talked about just kind of preconceived, having preconceived notions and putting those aside and just opening up. I was giving some examples. I was traveling last weekend and this weekend outside of the U.S. and I was sitting next to some people I probably should have spoken to a little bit more. It's easy to just sit on your phone and ignore the people around you, but you might, if you actually open up, look around you, listen, you actually can learn a lot. And that is a really valuable thing, whether you're at home, in your city, state, or outside the world. So we have to touch on a whole lot of reconciliation.
The question that we've started with was how do we reconcile when no relationship existed? What I threw out was that just resounded with me that quote from Australia, you said, if you come here to help us, you're wasting your time. And what does it say there?
But if you've come because your liberation is bound up in mind,
your liberation
then let's work together.
Let's work together.
Yeah.
That's almost exactly what Alex G. said many years ago to this congregation when we wanted to have a partnership with them. And he said, I don't want to sit around and talk about justice and injustice. I don't want to talk about it with you. We don't want to do that. But if you want to work with us and be with us, and do things together, we can have a relationship. And that was so many years ago, but it all came back to me. Yes, it's that, I saw that quote up there. And it's doing things together with those that we might not naturally choose to be with, or they might not choose to be with us. It's really what that is your humanity.
And we have some hope here with a lot of the leadership from our refuge group in helping us to get to know other parts of our community so that we can then begin to understand what their issues are as well. And millennials, leading us old folks, because they don't have time for the hypocrisies and the prejudices that they were born into. And that's the issue, there's no reason for any of this kind of divisiveness. There really is, they don't see gender differences, sexual preference differences, racial differences, ethnicity differences as meaningful.
Let me just challenge that, because I don't think that that's an accurate statement. It's more that there's a recognition that differences actually do make a difference, but they don't need to separate us. So acknowledging truly the identity differences is actually a key part of, I think, especially those younger than me and how they're conceptualizing identity. So really actually focusing on that in a way that maybe my generation or other generations have been afraid to, like learning the colorblindness, that it's actually much more about acknowledging and engaging across difference.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. But I wanted to make sure that it was clarified.
Got that figured out.
Cross-generational conversation. So
good. Just different ways of saying things. Yeah. So does anybody have a better sense of reconciliation now and how it may play into our lives? A better sense of what the confession maybe means, and some of the perhaps the layers and kind of multiple meanings that may be folded in there? Or is anybody still really confused? As confused as I was at the beginning as to what
I feel like I'm
reconciliation
struggling
means.
with what healing looks like, because I think to me that's the take-home point. That reconciliation really is about that healing process, acknowledging difference, and then binding the wounds. And what does that look like individually? Like I was thinking about your families. How do you bind the wounds? What do you need to be reconciled to your other members? What do they need to be reconciled to you? But then also writ large in our society, how do we bind wounds while we're also acknowledging structural racism or other historical things that have got us to this place? So I think that's the question I'm still left with is, what does that look like? How do I move forward in binding wounds?
I think it's helpful where we have family members that we want to have a relationship with, and have different political ideas or religious ideas. If we can love them and know we're loved by them and accept the differences, then we can have a good relationship.
I'm processing a little bit Dale's sermon, so I don't want to ruin this for you.
Should I
But, one of his points was God has a vision for how things ought to be. And actually, we often feel that. Our sense that things are not right in our community, our world, grows out of some sense where they ought to be different than they are. And so, in some sense, reconciliation is headed back to the way things ought to be, or returning things to that way, or getting things to that way. And I'm not sure they ever have been, or at least not in human history. But but there is a vision of how things ought to be, and that's the relationship we want to have.
Great. Well, we're about 5 after, and so I know second service people have got to go. Does anybody like to volunteer to close us in prayer? Okay. Hearing none, no, Doug, please.
Lord, thank you that you've done so much to allow us to be reconciled to you. Help us to live like that and desire to be reconciled with others. And teach us what it looks like. thank you for all of you folks here that are interested in refuge, movement, and reconciliation. Thank you for your presence. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.